In the winter of 1850, the port town of Drogheda was a place defined by hunger, desperation, and the quiet shuffle of thousands trying to survive the final brutal years of the Irish famine. Families wandered the streets, searching for work or food, and the children who survived seemed to float between homes, nameless and forgotten. A government workhouse was established on the edge of the marshes, an imposing structure with windows too small to let in sunlight and walls stained by constant moisture. Locals called it a place of mercy, but everyone knew it was a last refuge for the dying. Or for something worse. Thomas Kavanagh, a young clerk assigned to the workhouse, maintained the intake logbook that recorded every orphan who entered its gates. He was quiet and meticulous, and because of that, he noticed details others didn't. Some children were logged with names and family origins, but others appeared with only a number or a single letter, as if their identities were unimportant. When he asked about the inconsistencies, the supervisor gave a tight smile and said, "Not all children stay long enough for paperwork." Something in her tone suggested he shouldn't ask again. One evening, as Thomas was rewriting the day's entries, the supervisor handed him a wrinkled sheet of paper. Across the top, written in hurried ink, were the words, "Children bound for Canada." He was instructed to copy the names into the official ledger and prepare the transport documents. But as he scanned the list, he realized that several names did not appear anywhere in the intake registry. He had seen the children, though, silent ones who never joined meals, who watched everything without blinking. The next morning, Thomas approached the head matron to ask about the missing records. She pressed a finger to her lips and led him into a small side room lined with locked cabinets. From the lowest drawer, she withdrew a thin bundle of supplemental lists. "Copy them exactly," she whispered. "Ask no questions." Her voice trembled in a way that made Thomas's stomach tighten. The supplemental pages were unnerving. Some children had no names at all, only descriptions like "arrived after dark," "keep isolated," or simply 8 years, "quiet." Others seemed to have no age, no origin, nothing that tied them to a real life. As Thomas filled in the ledger, he realized many of these children moved differently than the others. They stayed in the shadows of the hallways, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly, as if they slipped through unseen doors. A week later, the ship, the Dunbrody, arrived to take the orphans to Canada. Townspeople gathered at the docks, relieved that these children might have a chance at a better future. The officially registered children lined up with blankets and small cloth bags, their faces pale but hopeful. Then the others appeared, the ones from the supplemental lists, walking in single file with expressionless faces. Their eyes were dark and unfocused, and even the sailors stepped back as they passed. That night, Thomas felt uneasy and returned to the workhouse to recheck the ledgers. When he opened the book, entire pages were missing. Names he had written only hours earlier had been torn clean from the binding. The supplemental lists were gone as well. Only the official, polished version remained, neat, orderly, and completely false. The next morning, Thomas learned that the Dunbrody had left port before dawn, hours ahead of schedule. Witnesses claimed they saw lanterns moving across the deck all night, but no sound ever came from the ship. No singing, no crying, no whispers, just footsteps and the creak of wood. When the ship vanished into the fog, Thomas felt as though the silence that followed had weight to it, pressing against his ribs. Rumours spread quickly. People claimed they heard knocking against their windows the night after the ship departed. One woman reported finding small footprints in the mud outside her door, though no children lived nearby. Workhouse staff moved nervously through the halls, speaking only in whispers. At night, Thomas thought he heard faint scratching coming from the cabinets where the supplemental lists had once been stored. Unable to ignore his rising dread, He went to the docks to ask about the ship's route. The harbour master, pale and trembling, revealed a troubling update. The Dunbrody's first message reported that several children had fallen ill. No symptoms were described, only that the sick children would not speak or respond. Then the message ended abruptly. Thomas asked if another report had come through. The harbour master swallowed hard and said yes, but it made little sense. The final message stated only, "They will not stay in their quarters." No details, no signature, and no follow-up. The voice that transmitted it had been distorted, as if carried through wind or water. That night, Thomas heard a soft scratching at his door. When he opened it, no one was there. On the ground lay a damp scrap of parchment, torn from the supplemental list. Written in shaky ink was a single word, return. His chest tightened as he realized the scrap was wet, not from rain, but from something else. Sleep came in short, broken fragments. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw the silent children boarding the ship, their blank faces staring forward. He wondered whom they would meet in Canada if they ever arrived, and he feared that whatever had been placed aboard the Dunbrody had not been meant for salvation. At dawn, he returned to the workhouse. The front gate stood open, something that never happened. Inside, the halls were empty. No workers, no laughter from the younger children, no sound at all. In the main office, the ledger sat open with a new page waiting. At the top was a fresh heading, Children for the Next Crossing. Thomas froze when he saw the names. Everyone belonged to children who still lived freely in Drogheda, children who had never entered the workhouse. There were no explanations, no annotations, only a single, neat list of victims. As he closed the ledger, he noticed faint wet footprints on the floor, leading toward the back corridor. He followed the prints to a locked storage room whose door now hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was cold and heavy. On the far wall, pinned in uneven rows, were dozens of parchment fragments. They were the missing supplemental lists, every one of them carefully displayed, except one. At the center of the wall hung a final page, larger than the rest. It had no names, no numbers, only a single sentence written in dark, deliberate ink. They were never meant to leave Ireland. As Thomas read the words, he felt the room contract around him. A soft pattering sound echoed behind him, like bare feet on stone. He turned. The corridor was empty. But the footprints that had led him here were gone. For the first time, Thomas understood the truth. Whatever had happened to the lost children didn't begin on the ship. It began in the workhouse, and it was still happening. He backed out of the room slowly, careful not to make a sound. Something moved in the shadows nearby, something small and patient, and waiting. For 3 days after discovering the wall of names, Thomas tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he'd seen. Maybe the lists were outdated, he told himself. Maybe the children in town were once on the workhouse rolls and then released. But each time he walked through Drogheda and saw those same children playing in the streets, laughing, chasing one another through the mud, his chest tightened. Their names were already written in a ledger that treated them like cargo. He decided to visit the parish priest, Father Brennan, a man who knew more than most about what passed quietly through the town. The priest listened in silence as Thomas carefully described the lists, the missing pages, and the strange ship messages. His expression hardened when Thomas mentioned the phrase, "They were never meant to leave Ireland." Instead of asking for clarification, Brennan rose, walked to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a folded letter stamped with an official seal. Father Brennan laid the letter on the table between them and tapped the wax with a blunt finger. It was dated 3 months earlier and came from a government office in Dublin. The letter approved the accelerated relocation of juvenile paupers and urged cooperation with workhouse authorities. At the bottom was a handwritten note that made Thomas's blood run cold. Previous attempts to export have not resolved the disturbances. Keep records minimal. Thomas stared at the note, his throat dry. Disturbances? He asked. What does that mean? Father Brennan didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured 2 small glasses of whiskey with unsteady hands. Before the Dunbrody, the priest said quietly, there were other ships and there were complaints, not about the children, about what seemed to come with them. According to the priest, rumours had circulated among sailors over the past year. Crews reported strange events whenever large groups of orphans were transported, footsteps overhead when no one was on deck, children who went missing and then appeared again below in locked rooms, voices whispering in languages no one understood. One captain swore that a child who had been buried at sea was seen standing at the rail 2 nights later. His ship never sailed again. Thomas listened, feeling the world tilt around him. If these accounts were even partly true, then the Dunbrody was not the beginning of something. It was part of a pattern. He asked if anyone had investigated the workhouses themselves. Father Brennan shook his head slowly and said that every time someone got too close, they were transferred, silenced, or conveniently discredited. People prefer stories about ghosts on the water, he said. It's easier than admitting something is wrong here on land. That night, the wind shifted and a thick fog rolled in from the sea. The town seemed to shrink, its sounds muffled and distant. As Thomas made his way home, he saw a figure standing at the corner of an alley, a child, motionless, half hidden in the mist. He called out, but the child didn't respond. When he stepped closer, the figure turned, and for a moment he recognized the face of a girl who had boarded the Dunbrody days earlier. Her eyes were wrong. They were too dark, as if the pupils swallowed everything around them. Water dripped from the hem of her dress, even though the ground beneath her was dry. Thomas blinked, and in that second of hesitation, a cart rumbled past between them. When it passed, the girl was gone. Only a wet patch remained where she had been standing, shaped vaguely like 2 overlapping footprints. Far out at sea, the Dunbrody pushed through churning water and growing unease. The crew kept the orphans below deck, but complaints began immediately. Men reported waking up with small handprints on their arms and ankles, as if something had tried to pull them from their hammocks. Others claimed they heard children playing in the cargo hold late at night, even though that area had been locked since departure. When they checked, they found nothing but rows of crates and the smell of damp wood. In the makeshift dormitory, the children slept in long rows of cots. At least they were supposed to. One sailor swore that when he did a head count, some of the children were lying perfectly still with their eyes wide open, staring not at the ceiling, but at a point just above it. Their mouths moved as if whispering to someone he couldn't see. When he shouted, they all seemed to wake at once, blinking in unison and asking what was wrong. By the 4th night, the captain ordered the group divided. The ones from the regular registry were moved closer to the stairs where the crew could check on them. The others, the silent ones, the ones with incomplete or fabricated histories, were kept in the far section of the hold. A wooden partition was built between them, but it did nothing to stop the cold that seemed to seep out from that end of the room. The air around those children felt heavy, as if the ship itself was sinking under their weight. Back in Drogheda, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something from that ship had already returned. He started waking in the night to the sound of faint tapping on the glass of his window, like fingernails or tiny knuckles. Each time he looked, there was nothing but his own pale reflection. Yet when he checked the outside sill in the morning, he found streaks of moisture as though someone had been standing there in the cold, breathing on the glass. He resolved to re-enter the locked storage room at the workhouse, but this time he didn't go alone. He convinced a groundskeeper named Eamon, a broad-shouldered man with more courage than sense, to accompany him. Together they slipped in after dusk, when the matron had left, and the halls were dim. The silence inside felt unnatural, as if the building were listening. They reached the storage room to find the door fully closed now, the splintered latch replaced by a new lock. Eamon produced a small metal tool he used for repairing hinges and set to work. As the lock gave way with a soft click, a smell of cold, stale air pushed out from the crack. It was the same odour Thomas remembered from before, earthy, metallic, like something that had been buried and then brought back too soon. Inside, the wall of pinned parchment was still there, but it had changed. Some names Thomas remembered from before were now crossed out. Next to those names, someone had written short notes in a tight hand. Not taken, resisted, disposed. Other names were still untouched, including several belonging to children who laughed earlier that day in the streets. Eamon scanned the rows, his eyebrows knitting together. "These are local kids," he murmured. "Half these names live no more than a mile from here." In the centre of the wall, the larger sheet with the sentence, "They were never meant to leave Ireland," was gone. In its place was a new message, written in darker ink as though pressed harder into the page. "But they found their way back." As Thomas read it, a draught passed through the room, making the pinned papers rustle like dry leaves. Somewhere behind them, a floorboard creaked softly. They turned, but the doorway was empty. Still, Thomas could feel the air moving oddly in the corridor beyond, as if someone small had slipped past them. Eamon stepped into the hall, calling out, convinced it was one of the children playing tricks. His voice echoed once, twice, then died away. No answer came, only the quiet drip of water from somewhere above, even though the ceiling looked dry. That same night, miles out on the open sea, the crew of the Dunbrody gathered on deck to discuss the growing sense of unease. Several sailors refused to go below at all, claiming they felt watched whenever they neared the children's quarters. The ship's doctor reported that the illness mentioned in the first dispatch was unlike anything he'd seen. The affected children were not feverish or weak. They were simply still. Too still. They did not respond when spoken to. Their chests rose and fell, but their eyes never moved. When he tried to lift their arms, he felt resistance, not limpness, as if some invisible force was holding their limbs in place. The worst part, he confided to the captain in a hoarse whisper, was that if you leaned in close enough, you could hear them humming. The tune dug itself into his mind, a low, repetitive melody with no clear beginning or end. On the sixth night, a storm hit. Waves slammed against the hull with such force that the ship seemed to shudder to its bones. Sailors rushed to secure lines while the wind screamed through the rigging. The captain ordered the children's quarters checked, worried they might panic or injure themselves. But when the crew opened the hatch, they found the unwell children sitting upright in their cots, swaying in unison with the motion of the ship, still humming that same eerie tune. The others, the healthy, registered orphans, were not calm. They were huddled against the far wall, eyes wide, some of them sobbing quietly. One boy grabbed a sailor's sleeve and begged to be moved anywhere else on the ship. "They're not children," he cried, pointing toward the humming group. "They don't sleep. They watch us even when their eyes are closed." His words were met with a harsh order to be silent, but the sailor who heard them never forgot. Back on shore, Thomas began visiting the families whose children were listed on the next crossing page. At first, He pretended to be checking on census details, asking harmless questions about ages and baptism records. But he couldn't keep up the act for long. The more children he met, the worse his dread became. They were real, vibrant, full of life, and yet already marked in a book that had no room for their futures. One mother, a tired-looking woman with deep lines around her eyes, mentioned that her daughter had started sleepwalking. At first, she had found it almost harmless, just the girl standing at the door, staring out into the darkness. But lately, the girl had begun waking up outside, barefoot, feet wet with morning dew. When Thomas gently asked the child where she went in her sleep, the girl replied, "I go where they call from, the place with the water and the knocking." The phrase made his skin crawl. He asked her who they were, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl frowned, as if confused by the simplicity of the question. "The ones who left but didn't go," she said. "They say there's no room where they are. They say some of us have to come instead." Her mother laughed nervously and dismissed it as a child's dream, but Thomas recognized the same logic that governed the ledgers. Exchange, not rescue. As days passed with no more messages from the Dunbrody, the harbour master grew restless. Other ships arrived, bringing news from distant ports, but none reported seeing the Orphan vessel. It was as if the ocean had simply swallowed it. Yet the strange phenomena in Drogheda continued. More children began to sleepwalk. More parents heard soft tapping on their windows at night. A few swore they saw pale faces reflected in basins of water that weren't their children's. One evening, Thomas stood alone on the dock, staring out at the black strip of horizon. The air smelled of salt and decay. He tried to imagine the ship somewhere out there, drifting, filled with children who were not entirely themselves. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider something truly terrible. That the Dunbrody might not be lost in the simple way people meant when they said a ship was lost. It might be searching. There, on the slick wooden boards beneath his boots, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A line of small footprints, spaced evenly, leading from the edge of the dock back toward town. They were not recent, the edges had softened, but they were clear enough to follow. The strange part was that there were no prints leading the other way. According to the marks pressed into the wood, whatever had come ashore hadn't returned to the water. As Thomas followed the trail into the fog-wrapped streets, he understood something he had suspected since the night he saw the girl near the alley. The story of the lost children of Drogheda was not only about those who had gone missing, it was also about those who had come back. And if he was right, part of what had returned was no longer interested in ships or lists or the approval of any office in Dublin. It was already here, walking barefoot through the town, choosing who would be next. The footprints Thomas followed through Drogheda led him into narrow streets where the fog pooled like water, gathering in doorways and clinging to the stones. He walked slowly, listening for anything unusual, but the town was silent. Even the usual sounds, the distant clatter of carts, the barking of stray dogs, were absent tonight. Every so often he stopped and pressed his hand to the ground to confirm what he already knew. The footprints were real, and they were leading him somewhere on purpose. They eventually stopped at the edge of the marsh near the old workhouse, the one place Thomas hoped he wouldn't be led back to. The building rose out of the fog like a dark, bloated shape, its windows flickering faintly with lantern light. Someone was still inside at this hour, moving between rooms in slow, deliberate steps. The footprints ended just short of the entrance, as if whatever left them didn't want to go inside, but wanted him to. His breath clouded in front of him as he stepped toward the door. Inside, the air felt colder than the night outside. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, swaying softly, casting warped shadows down the hallway. Thomas walked past the office where the ledger had been left open days earlier, but the desk was now completely bare. No paper, no quill, no sign that records had ever been kept here. The absence of the ledger felt more disturbing than any entry it might have contained. It was as if the building itself had decided to hide the evidence. From somewhere deeper in the workhouse came the soft sound of movement. Not voices, not footsteps, something more delicate, like fabric brushing against stone or fingers gliding along a wall. Thomas froze, listening. The sound repeated, then stopped. Slowly, he moved toward the long corridor leading to the children's dormitories, a place he hadn't visited since the ship departed. He could smell damp straw and cold iron. The first dormitory he entered was empty. The beds were stripped, the floor swept clean. Even the walls looked scrubbed, as if someone had tried to erase the room's history. In the second dormitory, a few toys were scattered across the floor. A wooden soldier, a cloth doll missing an eye, a small tin whistle. These were items belonging to the children who had sailed to Canada. Seeing them abandoned here made Thomas's skin crawl. It was as if the belongings had returned without the children themselves. In the third dormitory, he saw her. The girl from the docks, the one who had stood in the alley days after she should have been halfway across the Atlantic. She sat on a bed with her legs dangling over the edge, her hair wet and tangled, as though she had just climbed out of the sea. She watched him with those same dark, unfocused eyes. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Thomas felt his legs weaken. He whispered her name, hoping she would respond, but her expression didn't change. Instead, she slowly lifted her arm and pointed toward the hallway behind him. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and unsettlingly gentle. Thomas turned his head, expecting to see someone standing there, but the corridor was empty. When he turned back, the girl was no longer sitting on the bed. She was lying down, perfectly still, eyes closed, as if she had never been awake. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the building. Heavy steps, not the soft, dragging kind the children made. Thomas backed away from the bed and moved into the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings, accompanied by the faint clinking of keys. The matron appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. She carried a ring of keys that jingled with every step. When she saw him, she didn't look surprised. "You shouldn't be here, Thomas," she whispered. Her voice was thin, stretched tight like a frayed string. "The workhouse is empty now. There is nothing left for you to find." Her gaze flicked down the hall toward the darkened rooms. "They don't want to be disturbed." The way she said "they" made Thomas's stomach twist. He stepped forward and demanded to know what had happened to the ship, to the children, to the records. The matron's hand shook as she clutched the keys to her chest. "You don't understand," she said. "The Dunbrody didn't fail. It completed its purpose. But what it carried, it wasn't meant for Canada. It wasn't meant for anyone." Her voice cracked, and she took a step closer, lowering her tone. "They were supposed to stay hidden, but the sea does not hold what does not belong to it." Before Thomas could respond, a loud crash echoed from the storage wing, the room where the pinned lists had once hung. The matron's face drained of colour. "They're waking," she whispered, backing away. "I can't hold them anymore." She turned and fled down the corridor, keys jangling wildly. Thomas hesitated only a moment before sprinting toward the crash. When he reached the storage room, the door was half open again, its new lock broken clean off. Inside, cold air flowed out like a breath from an open grave. The pinned parchments were gone. Every sheet, every scrap, gone. In their place, written directly on the wall, were dozens of handprints made in some dark, wet substance. They were the size of children's hands, but elongated, the fingers too thin and too long. They formed a ring around a fresh message scrawled across the centre. "We've come back for the ones who were promised." Thomas stumbled backward, horrified. The air in the room began to shift, carrying a faint sound, breathing, but not from one person. Multiple breaths, shallow and rhythmic, rising and falling in unison from the shadows along the floor. He backed into the hallway as pairs of small, wet footprints began to appear one by one, forming a line that stretched toward him. The prints glistened as though the water had just dripped from the feet that left them. Panicking, Thomas fled the workhouse, bursting through the front doors into the fog-soaked night. He didn't stop until he reached the docks, gasping for air, trying to understand what he had seen. The sea was dark, the waves gentle, almost unnervingly calm. Then from somewhere far offshore a single lantern flickered. It bobbed once, twice, like a signal. Then another lantern appeared beside it. And then another. He watched as a faint outline took shape in the mist. A hull, a mast, a bow, leaning slightly to one side. It was impossible, yet there it was, a ship drifting silently toward shore. The Dunbrody had returned. The ship's deck was lifeless. No crew moved about, no voices called out, no ropes were thrown. Instead, the vessel drifted until its hull gently kissed the dock with a dull thud. Thomas approached, slowly, trembling. Lanterns flickered across the deck, casting long shadows. Something about the ship seemed wrong, as if its shape had been subtly altered by the sea. As he placed his foot on the gangplank, the boards gave off a damp, spongy sound. When Thomas stepped onto the deck, his breath caught in his throat. The surface of the ship was covered in faint, overlapping footprints, tiny, waterlogged impressions that crisscrossed every plank. They led toward the stairwell that descended into the hold. The hatch was open just a crack, and from the darkness below came the soft sound of humming. Familiar, steady, and horribly childlike, just as the doctor described. The lantern beside the hatch flickered. The humming grew louder, joined by the whisper of something brushing against wood. Something was moving down there, something that had left the ship, walked the streets of Drogheda, and returned again. Thomas's fingers tightened around the edge of the hatch. He knew he should turn back, run, warn the town, but he also knew he wouldn't be able to live with the questions. So he pulled the hatch open wider and descended into the darkness to see what had come home. The air in the hold of the Dunbrody was thick and wet, like breathing through a cloth dipped in seawater. Thomas gripped the rail as he descended, each step creaking under his weight. The humming grew clearer, resolving into a low, looping melody that seemed to seep from the wood itself. Lantern light from above barely reached the bottom of the stairs, leaving the corners of the space in heavy shadow. He felt, more than saw, that he was no longer alone. As his eyes adjusted, the outlines of cots appeared, rows of them, stretching into the dark. Some were empty, blankets neatly folded, as if waiting for occupants who would never return. Others held motionless shapes, small bodies lying stiff, faces turned toward the ceiling. Thomas forced himself closer, heart pounding. The humming didn't stop. It simply shifted, as if the voices were adjusting to his presence. He reached the nearest occupied cot and looked down. A boy lay there, eyes open, pupils blown wide, lips slightly parted. His skin was pale but not lifeless, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, even breaths. Thomas whispered the boy's name, one he remembered from the registry, and for the briefest moment the humming faltered. The boy's eyes flicked sideways to meet his, and in that instant Thomas saw something ancient and exhausted staring back. He stumbled to the next cot and the next, seeing the same pattern repeated. Children who should have been dead from exposure or illness were instead held in a kind of waking sleep. Their fingers twitched occasionally, as if grasping at something only they could feel. Every so often one of them would murmur a word under their breath, but it wasn't in any language Thomas recognized. It sounded like the creak of ice breaking or the slow roll of distant thunder. At the far end of the hold, the partition that had once divided the registered orphans from the supplemental ones had been broken down. Splintered wood lay scattered on the floor, soaked dark with seawater. Beyond it, in the deepest part of the hold, the air felt colder still. The humming was louder there, layered and discordant, like many voices trying to sing the same song, but starting on different notes. Thomas stepped over the broken boards and crossed the invisible line. The children in this section were sitting upright on their cots, backs straight, hands resting calmly on their knees. Their eyes were closed, but their heads swayed gently in time with the ship's movements. Water dripped steadily from their hair and fingertips, forming dark puddles beneath them. The smell of damp earth and iron was strongest here. Thomas realized with a sick twist in his gut that some of these children had no entries in any ledger at all, not even the supplemental lists. "Why did you come back?" he whispered, not sure who he was asking. One of the children, a boy with hair plastered to his forehead, opened his eyes. They were completely black, as if they'd been filled with ink. When he spoke, his voice carried an echo that didn't fit the small frame it came from. "We didn't," the boy said calmly. "We were sent back." Thomas asked by whom, but the boy only tilted his head, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. "You keep trying to send them away," the boy continued. "You keep putting them on ships, writing their names in books, pretending that distance can change what they are owed. But promises don't drown, they cling." His words seemed older than he was, like lines recited from a memory that didn't belong to him. The ship groaned suddenly, wood straining against the calm of the harbour, as if it were still in the middle of a storm. The lantern above Thomas flickered, casting the rows of children into jerky shadow. He heard movement behind him and turned to see more small shapes appearing from the darkness between the cots, stepping lightly onto the wet boards. They formed a loose circle around him, not touching, not speaking, just watching. One of the girls from the town stepped forward, her nightdress soaked to the hem. Thomas recognized her as the sleepwalking child who spoke of the place with the water and the knocking. She looked both exactly and not at all like the girl he'd met days earlier. Her face was the same, but her eyes were heavy with a tiredness far beyond her years. "You wrote my name," she said softly. In the next list, he shook his head, insisting that he had only copied what was given to him. The girl smiled sadly, as if that made no difference. "You kept the door open," she replied. "That's all it takes. A name, a line, a place saved." She lifted her hand and placed it flat against the side of the ship. Tiny droplets of water trickled from her palm, running down the wood like tears. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against Thomas's ears, making his head ring. Then a new sound began, faint at first, knocking. It came from beneath the floorboards, from the very bottom of the hull. Slow, rhythmic, like someone rapping weakly on a coffin lid. The children didn't react. They simply stood there, breathing in unison, while the knocking grew louder. Thomas backed toward the stairs, the urge to flee overwhelming. But as he turned, he saw someone blocking the top of the stairwell. It was the matron, her face blurred by the lantern above her head. She looked down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Pity, resignation, and something like relief. "It's been happening since before my time," she said quietly. "Since before any of us. They always come back for what they're owed." He shouted up at her, asking what they were, what the workhouse had done, why the lists existed at all. The matron sighed, shoulders sagging. "There were too many," she said. "Too many mouths, too much grief, too many lost." People started to talk about bargains, that if some were marked to go, the rest might be spared. The famine took the food, something else took the children. Her eyes glistened, and once a bargain is written, it's very hard to erase. The knocking from below turned frantic, as if many hands were pounding against the hull at once. Cracks appeared along the seams of the floorboards, thin lines of water seeping up like veins. The children stepped back from Thomas, clearing a space around him. The boy with ink-black eyes spoke again. "You can't stop the taking," he said. "But you can change who gets taken." His gaze was oddly gentle. "That's why they keep records." In that moment, Thomas understood the true purpose of the ledgers. They weren't just keeping track. They were choosing. Someone had decided which names would draw the thing that waited below, which children would be claimed so that others might be spared. Every list for transport, every crossing, was an offering disguised as charity. The workhouse hadn't just housed victims, it had fed something that knew how to read. A wave of nausea washed over him as he remembered the newest page in the ledger, the one filled with the names of children who still played in the streets of Drogheda. He saw their faces flash before him, laughing, running, alive. If the ship sailed again, it wouldn't just be carrying orphans. It would be carrying sacrifices that had been neatly signed off and stamped. And he was the one who had copied the names. The matron called down to him, her voice suddenly sharp. "You can't untie the knot, Thomas," she said. "You can only move it. Take the book and decide who carries the weight, or walk away and let the list stand." Her hand appeared at the top of the stairs, holding the ledger. It was open to the latest page. The ink shimmered wetly, even though he had written it days ago. He realized with a jolt of horror that the names were changing before his eyes. Letters slid, reforming into different combinations, as if the list was trying to choose itself. Some names blurred, others sharpened. At the bottom of the page, a new line began to write itself in slow, curling strokes. It spelled out his own name with agonizing care. Thomas Kavanagh, age 24, no dependents. The children watched him, waiting. The knocking below reached a fever pitch. Water seeped through the boards in thin streams now, pooling around his boots. Thomas clutched the ledger, fingers digging into the cover. He could cross his name out, he realized. He could push the ink aside, redirect the choice back to the others, or he could let it stand and hope that by giving himself, he might close whatever door had been opened generations ago. He thought of the girl in the nightdress, standing barefoot in the dew. He thought of the children who had already vanished on this ship, on others, in storms that ate vessels whole and left no wreckage. He thought of the lists pinned to the wall, of the note that read, "But they found their way back." Maybe the only way to make sure they stopped coming back was to stop sending anyone at all, to end the bargain with a final name. Very slowly, Thomas lifted the quill that lay beside the ledger. His hand shook so badly that ink splattered across the page. He took a deep breath, then struck through his own name once, twice, pressing the feather down until it nearly tore the paper. Then, in the narrow space below the last line, he wrote a single sentence in quick, jagged strokes. No more crossings, no more lists. The words were messy but clear. The ship lurched violently, nearly throwing him off his feet. The knocking from below stopped all at once, leaving a horrible, ringing silence. The water that had seeped through the boards began to recede, pulled down by an unseen force. The children wavered like reflections in disturbed water. Some of them blinked rapidly, as if waking from a long dream. Others simply faded, their outlines unravelling into mist that curled toward the cracks in the wood and slipped away. At the top of the stairs, the matron watched with wide, wet eyes. "You've broken it," she whispered, sounding halfway between awe and terror. "Do you know what that means?" Thomas looked up at her, exhausted. "It means there's nothing left to feed," he said quietly. "If they come back now, they come back empty-handed." The idea sounded brave in his mouth, but he knew it also meant something else. They might come back angry. When he finally stumbled up onto the deck, dawn was breaking over Drogheda. The fog that had swallowed the town for days was thinning, lifting in pale strands that drifted out to sea. The ship beneath his feet felt heavier, more solid, as if whatever had hollowed it out from within had finally departed. As he stepped onto the dock, he heard distant church bells ringing, a sound so ordinary it almost made him cry. In the days that followed, people noticed changes. The sleepwalking stopped. The tapping at windows faded. Parents reported that their children slept through the night for the first time in months. At the workhouse, the rooms stayed empty, the beds unfilled. No new lists were drawn up. No more ships arrived to relocate orphans across the ocean. Officials in Dublin sent letters demanding reports. None were answered. Eventually a storm hit the coast, and when it passed, the Dunbrody was gone. Some said it had broken free and drifted out to sea. Others insisted they saw it sink straight down where it lay, swallowed without a ripple. The harbour records showed no official incident, just a blank space where a ship's name should have been. Locals quietly agreed not to speak of it to outsiders. Some things were better left undocumented. As for Thomas Kavanagh, his name appeared only once more in any official record. A brief note in a parish ledger mentioned that he had left town in poor health and was not seen again. No date of death, no burial site, no relatives listed. Father Brennan, when asked, would only say that some men carried burdens that could not be measured, and sometimes the only way to put them down was to keep walking until no one remembered why you were carrying them in the first place. But in Drogheda, stories persisted. Fishermen claimed that on certain mist-heavy mornings they could hear faint humming over the water, as if carried from a great distance. Children who grew up in the town were warned never to answer if someone knocked on their window at night and spoke their name. And every so often someone exploring an old attic or cellar would find a piece of parchment tucked between boards or under loose stones. Always the same thing, a fragment of a list with all the names worn away, except one half-faded, barely legible. The lost children of Drogheda, people called them. Not just the ones who disappeared, but the ones who almost did. The children whose names were nearly written, nearly sent, nearly taken. The story never made it cleanly into the history books. On paper, it was just another ship, another group of orphans, another tragic crossing lost to the sea. But if you stand on the docks at night and listen closely, the locals say, you can still hear small footsteps on wood that isn't there, moving away from the water, not toward it. Not. If you're still here, listening in the dark with your headphones on, thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Somewhere out there, the Dunbrody is just a line in a forgotten record, But the children of Drogheda are still walking the edge between history and something else. Maybe they were saved. Maybe they were just spared for now. If this story gave you chills or made you look twice at the nearest window, do me a favor. Hit the like button so more people stumble across this episode, and subscribe if you want more slow-burn horror stories hidden inside real history. Tell me in the comments, do you think Thomas actually broke the bargain? Or do you think something just found a different way to collect? I'll be reading your theories tonight. And if you're listening to this to fall asleep, I hope the only footsteps you hear are your neighbors upstairs. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.